Hello, today we're going to be teaching some watercolor techniques. So I'm going to show you some techniques here and then I'm going to demonstrate how you can use them over here on an actual project type thing. So first things first, you need to have your watercolor set. You need to have a paper towel, preferably like a couple pieces that are ripped some pieces off so that you have some for blotting. And you need to have a cup of water and a paintbrush. All right, so some other optional things you can have that I'm going to demonstrate. Salt, this is my salt shaker, I've drawn it here. And a crayon. I don't have a crayon, so I'm going to be using a wax candle. So make sure you get permission before you start using your people's candles, okay? But so what I'm going to do first is I'm going to just go down the line with the demonstration. So the first technique is pretty simple, pretty easy. All you do is you take your paintbrush, you dunk it in water like this, tap off the excess, and then you want to pick a color. I'm just going to demonstrate with purple. So I'm just going to take my purple. I'm going to pet it gently. I don't want to viciously scrub or push down really hard. I'm just going to gently pet the color until I see it starting to activate. So this one I've already used recently, so I can see it's already coming up on my paintbrush, so it's ready to go. So wet on dry is mostly used for really detailed areas that you want to have a lot of control over. So depending on the quality of your paintbrush, you can actually fully write on like your name, or you can draw really tiny details. If you notice that your pigment's not very bright, all you have to do is just pick up some more on your paintbrush. And then try to use just the tip of your brush. Don't use the entire brush, because otherwise it's going to be really messy. So here I can write my name, draw little squiggles, little snowflakes. So you get a lot of control with the wet on dry. So a lot of people are scared of watercolor because they feel like it's not very controllable. But if you use the wet on dry technique, you can control it to an extent. Now, if you do touch another area that is wet, it will start kind of bleeding into each other. So be careful of that. That's where it does get a little crazy. All right, so in this particular picture, if I wanted to use the wet on dry, I would want to use it on a very specific part that I want it to be very, very clean and crisp. So what I would do is I'd want to use it like on the nose here. So I'm going to use that on the nose, and then I want to leave a little white highlight on the nose just so that it's not so solid, because I like leaving little areas of brightness. All right, so there would be on the nose, and then maybe a little bit around the eyes like this. So this little dot in the middle is going to be the highlight of my eye, so that's why I'm leaving it like that. Now, you can also do a thing called layering. So like if you paint a layer, then you can always go on top of it with another color once it's dry, and that can create a really cool effect as well. All right, so I'm just going to do the eyes, and then maybe I want to have my mouth line pretty distinct, so I'm going to go ahead and outline that. Anytime you run out, just very gently pet back on your paint palette, and then you're just going to continue. All right, so I think that's pretty much all that I want to have outlined. The rest of it, I want to do some softer colors. So while I'm letting that dry, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next technique. Very important, anytime you switch colors, always, always, always rinse off your paintbrush by just doing a very gentle swirl at the bottom of your cup, and then tap off the excess. You don't want to vigorously scrub, otherwise you're going to ruin your bristles. So always be gentle with your paintbrush. All right, so now that I've rinsed my brush, I'm going to go ahead and move on to my wet on wet technique. So for this one, you want to make sure that you have clean water on your brush, and then you want to go ahead and pick your color. I'm going to have orange over here for my wet on wet technique. So what you're going to do is you're going to first hydrate your color. So make sure that your color is ready to go by gently petting it. And then once it's ready to go, then what you're going to do is you're going to take a clean paintbrush. So I'm going to swirl it gently. And then I'm not going to tap off the water this time. I'm going to leave that excess water so it's a little drippy. Now, if you have a really big paintbrush, you might want to tap it a couple times so that it's not super, super damp. So what I'm going to do on this one is I'm actually going to go ahead and just, I call it flooding. You're just going to fill in the whole box with just water. And then afterwards, you just pick up your color. And then anywhere that you want the color up here, you're just going to press down on it, and it's going to tap, and that color is going to do what's called blooming out. And here we can see that it's really dark here, but it's kind of fading softer over here. You can also control that. Use your paintbrush to kind of help it move around like this. So this works really great for if you want to have a large area covered at once. Like say if you're trying to go for a very kind of smooth color, this is a great technique with that. Notice that I have not put more paint on the brush. I'm just moving the current color around so it's creating a smoother effect. And if you ever get too much water on your like your area that you're painting, you can just use a paper towel and kind of blot it off. It might take off some of the color, but that's okay. Just use your paintbrush while it's still wet, and then just move it back into the area that you blotted. So if you ever have like a giant puddle of water, feel free to just use like the corner of a paper towel or something like that to take up that excess water because it's going to soak it right up. Now, you can use tissues. If you use toilet paper, it might get a little crumbly, so just be careful of that. All right, so now a word of caution, very important. If you just painted an area, make sure it's totally dry before you try this, because if you, like say, I don't know if this, oh, this is already dry. Well, pretty much, I don't know. So if I take water and go over this, notice that it's making that purple bleed. So be very careful of rushing it. You want to take your time before you apply it to your picture. So while this is drying, because that nose is still a little bit wet, while that's drying, I'm going to wait to use this technique. I'll use it after I use this salt. So for the salt technique, it works with both wet on dry and wet on wet. I find that it works better with the wet on wet though. So that's what the technique that I'm going to use. So I'm just going to take my salt shaker and put a little bit of salt. Oh, that's a lot of salt. Get a little bit of salt. I'm going to set that off to the side so I can just pinch it out later. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the same technique I just did. So I'm going to get some water, spread it on the thing, and I'm going to use my purple because I think it'll stand out more. So then pick up my purple very gently. I'm going to put it in the center, let it bloom out. It's really cool to watch the wet on wet technique because the blooms look really neat. All right, I'm going to spread that color out a little bit. Now, this part's very important. You want to do this before it dries, okay? So quickly pick up your salt, and then you're just going to sprinkle it on there. As you sprinkle it on there, you'll notice that you're going to get these really dark dots. What's happening is anywhere that the salt hits, the salt is going to start absorbing both the water and the paint, so it's going to take off that stuff. So you have to let it fully dry before you touch it, though. Painting is all about patience here. So let that fully dry before you move it, but whenever you do move it, it's going to create a really cool effect. So this is dry now, so I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate the wet on wet technique, and I might add a little bit of salt just because it's a salt shaker. It might look pretty cool. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start with the areas, I want to do orange. So I'm just going to use the wet on wet on the parts that I want orange. Now, if it's white, I'm just going to leave it white. I'm not going to apply the water in the parts that I want white. I just want to apply it in the parts that I want orange. Now, the reason I'm doing that is because the watercolor is not going to go in the places that are dry. So as long as I leave it dry, the water will not follow, or the color will not follow. So here I've gotten my water on the parts that I want to have orange, and then I'm just going to very gently move my orange paint around like this. And you can always pick up some more if you want more of a bright orange. Just moving it around in the parts that I got wet. And that's going to allow me to have a very nice smooth effect. If you try to paint with the wet on dry, you can get a smooth effect if you're fast enough, but sometimes it'll look very, very splotchy or like very, very streaky if you're trying to paint using the wet on dry. That's why using the wet on wet technique by adding water first can make a much smoother surface. So here I like how the surface is smooth. So something that you can do is if you notice that there's like a hard edge, like if the edge is really stiff, you can take just pure water. So I've rinsed off my brush, and then you can just kind of pet that pure water into the areas that you want to kind of soften it up. So if you want it to fade a little bit, just pet water on your paintbrush in the areas that you want to look a little bit softer. So here I'm fading out the color so it goes from a orange to kind of more of a pale color as it gets closer to the face. And you can do that indefinitely just until you get to the part that you are satisfied with. So here I like how it's kind of more of a pale color here and a darker color out here. So that's what I'm going to leave. Once again, if you have any large petals, you can just take a tissue and just very gently let the tissue kind of lift off that color. Or lift off the excess water. So a little bit of excess water isn't bad, but you just don't want there to be like a gigantic puddle. All right, so next technique, we can actually kind of already see the salt working if you can kind of see where it's starting to feather out a little bit. So I'm going to come back on with the salt whenever I get this later on. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it like this. All right, so the next technique is the gradient. This is really helpful when you're doing shading or whenever you want to fade from one color to the other. So I personally like to do gradient with both wet on dry and wet on wet. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to just use wet on dry. I'm going to mix together orange and this darker orange. So I'm going to first paint one color on one side, like this. Rinse off my paintbrush. Pick up my darker color right here. Paint this on the other side. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave a little spot in between. And then I'm going to use just water. So this is the wet on wet. I'm going to use water and then just apply water in between the two, like this, just pet back and forth, and then just let it naturally start blending. If it's not blending very well for you, you can also take water, so rinse off your paintbrush, squeeze off the excess water, and then use kind of a drier brush and kind of zigzag in between the two while it's still wet. And then that can help force a little bit of blending to happen. Now, if you're using a wet paintbrush when you do that, like if it's drippy wet, it's going to add more water and it might kind of lessen the effect. So just with a drier paintbrush, just by squeezing off the excess water, you can use that to help kind of move it around a little bit to get that to kind of blend more. So here I have a nice blend between the orange and then it fades off into that darker color. This works fantastically if you're layering your colors. So here I have this top part is mostly dry. This bottom part you can still see is a little wet, but I can use this gradient effect to kind of blend my colors. So I already have my first color down, so I don't necessarily have to mix it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my darker color here, and then I'm going to do just in the parts that I want in shadow. So let's say if I wanted to have a little bit of a shadow right here behind his ear, what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply a little bit of that red in the parts that I want darker. Now, I wouldn't suggest doing too much at once because the colors do dry really fast and you want to work while it's wet. I'm going to rinse off my brush, get a little bit of that water off, but I still want it to be a little damp. And then I'm just going to blend by petting back and forth along the edges so that it's going to mix those colors. Every now and then I'm just going to remove my paintbrush and kind of like squeeze off that excess water so that I get a little less of that water on there. And I'm just going to be very gently petting back and forth until I get the desired look on my painting. So here I'm starting to get a nice color blend. I'm going to have a little bit down here. So I'm going to apply a little bit on the parts that I want the shadow to be. Maybe a little bit more right here because I lost a little bit of it. So never be afraid to add some layers just to make it look more interesting. So you can add multiple layers of the same color and it can look pretty cool. All right, so rinse off my brush, squeeze off that excess water, and then I'm just going to very gently kind of pet the areas that I want to be blended in. Once again, don't try to work on too many areas at once because you do want to do this while it's still wet. If you let it dry, you can still blend it to an extent. It's just going to be a little bit harder to blend whenever it gets dry. So you always want to do that blending effect when it's still wet. All right, so now you can see how that has formed a gradient, so it makes it look as though it is shaded, which makes it look pretty interesting. So now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do the mixing. So for the mixing colors, let's say if you have a palette that is limited, like say if you don't have a whole bunch of different colors, say that I wanted to make a green color, you can easily do mixing. I like to do the wet on wet, so I'm going to first add water. After I add water, I'm then going to pick up a yellow. I'm going to first apply yellow on there, and then rinse off your brush, and then you want to do this pretty quick before it dries. Pick up a blue, and then just a tiny, tiny bit, I'm going to add it in the corner here. And then I'm going to try to mix in that blue with that yellow and see if I can get it to turn into a green. So here I'm starting to get a lime green color, which is actually really pretty. And that was made by mixing the yellow and the blue. Now, if you don't know how to mix your colors, you might want to refer to a color wheel. So a color wheel is going to tell you what colors are going to mix together. So like yellow and blue are going to make green, and like red and yellow are going to make orange, and purple and red are going to make purple, etc. So you can mix your colors on here. So if you don't have colors, you can mix. A very common color that people have a hard time with is skin tones. If you have a really pale skin tone, you can just take, here, I'm going to do this off to the side. So if you have like a really pale skin tone, you can take just water and then add a little bit of orange to it. Not very much, not very much. And then water that down by just blending it, and that's going to help make kind of a skin tone. If it's too like of a peachy skin tone and you want more of a reddish skin tone, add just a tiny bit of red, not very much. A little bit of red, stir it in, and then you have a little tone. And you can do this on your palette. A lot of times palettes will have empty spaces. Here you can see I've done a lot of mixing on my palette. I suggest mixing off the palette or off the paper, and then you can just transfer that over. So here I have a kind of a neutralish skin tone, and then if you want it darker, I would suggest either adding little hints of brown or little hints of more kind of an orange color, and if you want lighter, just add more water. That's the thing about mixing, is if you want something paler, you just have to add more water to make it look like a lighter color, so that's how you can mix. So that's just a little technique that you can do. I'm not going to do that on here just for time's sake. All right, blotting. This is where we've actually kind of been doing this already. Here you can see the salt is starting to really take a cool effect. All right, so for blotting, you're just going to put a color down, and this can be with wet on wet or wet on dry. We haven't done wet on dry in a while, so I'm gonna go ahead and do that. So I'm gonna apply a little bit of this color here. All right, so blotting, you have to be pretty quick at it. So blotting is just going to take off the color that is already there. So if you take a paper towel, and then you're just going to press down wherever you want to lift off that color. So like say if I wanted to have a paler spot there, as long as you get it before it's dry, this works really great for clouds, by the way. As long as you get it before it's totally dry, you can get it to where you lift off that color. Now, if it is dry and you're like, ooh, I really want that to be a paler color, you can still do blotting. All you have to do is you're just going to take water. Is this dry? Yeah. You're just going to pet water on the area like this, and it's going to start lifting that color. And then you can just press down and it will lift off that color, okay? Now, it's a little harder to do that with the darker colors, but it should work pretty easily with some of those colors. So for instance, right here on my example, I have the eyebrow went down too far with the paint. So I'm just going to pet very gently that water above the eyebrow. And then I'm just going to press down with my paper towel to try to blot it. And then it should lift it off. So notice that I've cleaned up that eyebrow area. I'm gonna do the same thing over here just because I went a little too far with my color. And then just press down. Notice that I'm just pressing down, I'm not moving it side to side. That's gonna keep it a cleaner lift off. So here I've kind of cleaned it up just a little bit more and I'm more satisfied with that. So watercolor is not like super like unhelpful, like you can always go back and fix it. All right, so that's blotting. The splotch, I actually really like this one. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna first just paint it a color, doesn't matter what. So I'm just going to paint it purple just because it shows up really good on the camera. And I'm using the wet on dry technique like this. All right, so for the splotch, what you do is you just take a little bit of water. Now this works with it's dry as well, so you can do this when the paint's dry. I'm just going to do it while it's still wet. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to tap like this. And here I've gotten a few drops of water. And what it's doing is the water is pushing the paint to the edge of the droplet, and it's going to create these really cool texture effects like this. So be very careful though, if you are doing this on your project, I would suggest cover the parts that you don't want to have splotched with a paper towel or a paper so that you don't accidentally splotch parts that you did not intend to, because it is a little bit hard to control. Now you can do this in a more controlled way if you just like literally put a drop of water on the paper like this. That will kind of work as well. So you have to, if it's dry, you just have to give it time. The water's going to naturally start forcing that paint to kind of move around a little bit. All right, so the resist, I don't have a crown, surprisingly. So the only thing I have in my house that is wax related is a candle, so I'm going to be using that. It's a lot easier with a crown though, okay? It works really good with paler crowns like white, but you can do this with any color. So for resist, what you're going to do is you're going to be using the wax, aka the crown. And you're just gonna do a mark. Mine's really big, so I can't really do much, so I'm just gonna draw like a couple lines there and then get rid of my excess wax. So for you, you can use a crayon and just draw whatever designs. You can actually see with the light hitting it, the wax kind of occurring there. I'm just gonna add a little bit of something in the back there, so just like a couple lines, maybe a little scribbly scribble, and then I'm just gonna wipe off the excess. All right, so what I'm gonna do for this is you can use the wet on wet or the wet on dry. And I want to have a little paper towel handy so that I can blot if I need to. So I'm just going to use purple again because it shows up pretty well. All right, so here I'm going to paint over it. And you'll notice that anywhere that I had that wax, the paint is not sticking to it. This works really good if you want to have like a pattern or a texture design. This works really good if you want to do like a brick wall. Draw all the white lines in the brick wall with just a white crayon first, and then you can just paint all of your bricks without having to paint every individual square. So here we can see that that wax has resisted it really well. If you notice that it's not working very well, it's probably because you didn't press down hard enough with the crown. And you can always take the paper towel and dry up if the wax is puddling and you got some puddles and stuff happening above. So if I take, I don't know what design I did up here. Oh, geez. Yeah, so a lot of design happening up in there. So that's something that you can see that's happening. So I'm just going to go ahead and do my background all purple here. I'm also going to incorporate the, what is it called? I'm going to incorporate the salt in the background since I didn't get to do that earlier because this is my salt shaker. I'm also going to do a gradient. So here you can see that I'm starting to run out of color. So I'm just going to go ahead and keep going until my brush is totally out. And this is a great way to create a fade effect, as if you just continue without dipping it back in the paint. So here we can see this is a darker purple on this side, and then it turns into a lighter purple as it gets to the other side. You can also fade it out by adding water as you're going as well. All right, so now before that dries, I'm gonna get some salts. Sprinkle, sprinkle, salt, salt. Don't go too crazy with the salt. If you go too crazy with the salt, you're going to have like a really messy, just craziness. So I'm just going to sprinkle mild amounts of salt on there. Now, if you don't do it fast enough, you'll notice that the salt isn't collecting any puddles. So make sure that you are adding salt as soon as you can. Don't wait to add the salt. All right, the very last technique I'm going to show you is dry brushing. For dry brushing, it's pretty obvious. You're just going to dry off your brush completely. The drier it is, the better. Like this. All right, so now that my brush is drier, I'm going to pick a color. I'm just going to demonstrate with purple again. I'm going to dip it in the color, or just like very gently touch the paintbrush to the color. And then I'm going to actually pet it on a paper towel just to get it a little bit drier. And then this is more of a texture thing, so it works really great for like grass or for fur, like this. So a dry brush is going to keep it very, very rigid, and it's also going to keep it to where it has a little bit of a heavy texture to it. So that's how dry brush works. So if I wanted to add a little bit of a fluffy fur texture, I'm going to rinse this off and pick up a darker orange here. All right, so if I wanted to add a little bit of a fluff texture, I could take this color, dry it off a little bit, and then I can add a little bit of that fluff texture happening around the edges here, which I think I might have picked a too pale of a color, but no, it's actually showing up. It's looking cute. All right, so I'm just gonna add a little bit of dry brush, just give it a little bit of a fluff texture to make it more interesting. And notice that it's really adding layers to that color is really making that look a little bit brighter and more intense, which looks pretty interesting. And here you can see the salt already taking effect on my example piece, which I think looks pretty cool. All right, so, and of course you can combine these techniques. Like right here, I really want this orange to really stand out, so I'm gonna add a little bit of a darker orange here. And then I'm going to try to fade it up here so that it doesn't look so obviously like awkward. So I'm going to take my brush, squeeze out the extra water, and then I'm going to work on creating that gradient effect by just kind of petting that edge right there so that I get a softer effect. So now that makes the eyebrow area look more interesting, which I really like. And then, of course, you can incorporate different colors and stuff. Like if I wanted to shade this area down here, I'd maybe do like a little bit more of a bluish color to kind of make it look as though this is like the white part of the body, so that kind of makes it look a little bit different than the rest of it. So adding a little bit of a blue fade, maybe a little bit of blue below the eyes and into the parts that should have a little bit of shadow. And then, of course, using my paintbrush, just squeezing off that water and then kind of petting it so that it blends it a little bit more. Like this. Just add a little bit more variety to my piece. All right. So I think that's pretty satisfactory. The only thing that I would really change about this picture is I'm going to lighten up this one using the blotting technique, because I think it would look more interesting if the inside of the ears were paler or more white. So I'm just going to blot those. And then I add a little bit of that blue color in there. All right, so there's my example piece. Words. Sorry. Sorry, I get literally focused whenever I'm doing. All right, so here you can see that I've used most of these techniques on this little example. You can use any combination of these techniques, and there are more techniques that I did not show you yet. It's just that there's you just have to kind of experiment and stuff. Here you can see the splotch. I added a lot of water, so you can see those rough edges that it got really dark, but the inside stayed really pale. That's kind of what the splotch is going to do. I usually reserve this for background textures just because I think it looks pretty interesting. So if you were to kind of like splotch like these areas back here, and then give it time, it'll start having kind of this effect on the edge of wherever you put those water bubbles. Okay, so I hope that you guys learned something, and best of luck. Okay, thanks.